Richard Carpenter has always been the quiet one. While Karen stood in the spotlight, her voice flawless, her smile radiant, Richard was just steps behind, composing, arranging, protecting her, or so he thought. Because behind the music, behind the carefully crafted image of America's golden duo, was a secret he's carried for more than 40 years. A secret he never dared to say out loud. Until now. At 78, Richard Carpenter is no longer just the surviving half of a duo. He's the last keeper of a truth that nearly destroyed him. A truth he's finally ready to share. What really happened to Karen Carpenter, why no one saw it coming, and the one moment Richard says he will never forgive himself for. It changes everything we thought we knew. Long before the fame, before the gold records and glowing headlines, there was just a brother and sister making music in a small California home. Karen was shy, tomboyish, and nothing like the polished star the world would later adore. And Richard, he was the quiet perfectionist. Together, they weren't just siblings. They were a team. One of those rare pairs who didn't need to speak to understand each other. Richard once said their childhood bond was almost telepathic. If he played a note, she instinctively knew where to take it. If she faltered, he adjusted. If he struggled, she waited. It was never spoken. It just was. In interviews, Richard always described Karen as funny, goofy, and endlessly talented. But behind those sweet memories was something heavier. A sense that even back then, something wasn't quite right. She didn't eat much. She was obsessively private. And she had a tendency to brush off concern with a smile. At the time, no one questioned it. Not even Richard. They were too busy chasing the dream. By the late 1960s, their harmonies had caught the attention of Herb Alpert, and the Carpenters signed with A&M Records. It was the start of something magical, something the world hadn't heard before. And Karen? Her voice stopped people in their tracks. Warm, melancholy, pure. Even as a teenager, she could deliver a lyric like she'd lived through heartbreak. But she hadn't, not yet. She was still just a girl from Downey, California. Still learning how to navigate interviews. Still learning how to shrink herself into the image people expected of her. And Richard, he became the architect of it all. He picked the songs, built the arrangements, controlled the sound. Not because he wanted power, because he wanted to protect her. The industry was harsh, especially for young women. And Karen didn't have the armor. She was trusting, gentle, and painfully eager to please. In hindsight, Richard admits he may have made her too perfect, too polished, too controlled. The voice that soothed the world was slowly erasing the girl behind it. By 1970, they longed to be close to you, made them superstars. Karen was 20. Richard was 24. They were winning Grammys, topping charts, selling millions of records. But privately, things were beginning to crack. Karen hated how she looked in magazine photos. She worried about her weight, constantly. And she began skipping meals during press tours, rehearsals, even recordings. Richard noticed. Of course he did. But at the time, he chalked it up to stress. They were in demand, barely sleeping, constantly performing. He never imagined it was something darker. Something that would one day take her life. And the guilt of that, of not seeing it sooner, is something he says never truly left him. To the world, the Carpenters were flawless. But to Richard, every chart-topping hit was slowly becoming a memory soaked in regret. Because now, when he hears her voice, he doesn't just remember the music. He remembers the things they didn't say. Fame had changed everything. Not just their schedule or their lifestyle, but Karen. Richard could see it, even if he didn't want to. The girl who used to laugh at nothing, who used to eat peanut butter straight from the jar while they played piano duets. She was retreating. Quieter. Smaller. Tired in a way that went beyond exhaustion. At first, he chalked it up to overwork. Everyone was burnt out. They had just come off a grueling tour across Europe, followed by months in the studio. Karen had always been private. Always independent. Maybe she just needed space. But it wasn't just space she was creating. It was distance. From everyone. She began recording vocals alone. asking to redo takes that sounded perfectly fine to Richard. She was constantly worried about how she looked, on album covers, TV specials, even candid backstage photos. Richard would tell her she looked beautiful, that she sounded better than ever. She'd smile, nod, and still skip dinner that night. And then, one day, she fainted in the studio. They were midway through recording a ballad, something haunting and orchestral. Karen's voice had been shaky all morning. She said it was just nerves, but Richard could tell it was more. When she collapsed, Richard rushed to her side. She waved it off. "Low blood sugar," she mumbled, trying to stand. She didn't want to go to a doctor. She didn't want anyone to make a fuss. But Richard couldn't ignore it anymore. He went home that night and sat at the piano, played one of their earliest songs. But he couldn't get through it. The keys blurred. The notes felt wrong. Because deep down, something in him had shifted. This wasn't just about fatigue. It wasn't about nerves. It was something Karen wasn't saying. And the more she smiled, the more worried he became. She had always been good at hiding pain. That was the irony. The same vulnerability that made her voice so unforgettable was the same vulnerability that made her suffering invisible. And Richard, he was too close, too protective, too blind to the warning signs. Looking back, he admits he saw it, he just didn't want to believe it. She'd wear oversized clothes, claiming she preferred the look. She'd push food around on her plate and say she already ate. She was cold all the time, even in the California heat. And the weight kept dropping, quietly, steadily, until it was impossible not to see. Friends began to whisper. Their parents grew concerned. But whenever Richard brought it up, Karen would change the subject, or make a joke, or tell him to focus on the music. And he did, because that was their escape. If they could just finish the next album, if they could just get through the next tour, maybe things would settle. Maybe she'd be okay. But she wasn't okay. And Richard was starting to feel like he was the only one who didn't see it soon enough. He later admitted he had one overwhelming thought in those years. I should have stopped the machine. The label, the press, the expectations, they were all part of it. But so was he. He was the older brother. He was the producer. He was supposed to protect her. And somewhere between the music and the silence, he had failed. By 1975, the whispers had turned into quiet concern. Karen was vanishing visibly. In public, she still smiled, still performed, still hit every note. But offstage, she was barely eating, barely sleeping, and constantly talking about her weight. She'd step on the scale multiple times a day. She'd talk about her arms, her hips, her face, always with a tone of quiet disgust. And yet, she never called it what it was. Neither did Richard. Anorexia nervosa wasn't something people talked about in the 70s. There were no awareness campaigns, no treatment centers. It was whispered about, if at all, and mostly misunderstood. To Richard, it looked like self-discipline, like stress, like perfectionism taken too far. But deep down, he knew. And that knowing, that helpless knowing, was the part that began to break him. He tried to intervene, softly at first, urging her to rest, to eat. He even canceled a few studio dates behind her back, hoping the downtime would help. But it didn't. Karen became irritable, defensive, distant. She insisted she was fine, that everyone was overreacting. I'm just trying to stay healthy, she'd say. Richard didn't push. He didn't want to make things worse. They were working on a new album. The pressure was mounting. The label was growing impatient. They needed her to look like Karen Carpenter. That was the thing no one ever said out loud. Behind closed doors, industry executives were asking questions. Could Karen lose a little more weight? Could she wear something more flattering? They didn't know they were feeding a disorder. They just wanted her to fit the image. And Karen? She heard every word. She wasn't just fighting her body. She was fighting a standard she could never meet. In 1976, things reached a breaking point. Richard walked into a rehearsal and barely recognized her. Her face was sunken. Her wrists were like twigs. Her voice, still beautiful, was growing weaker, more fragile. He pulled her aside, told her something was wrong, told her they had to stop. And for the first time, she didn't argue. She sat down and cried, not just because she was hurting, but because she was tired of hiding, of pretending, of living up to an image that never truly fit her. She told him she'd been trying to control something, anything, in a life that felt out of control. The fame, the pressure, the touring. Everyone wanted something from her, and no one ever asked what she wanted. That conversation haunted Richard for years, because even then, even after she admitted the pain, she didn't ask for help. She asked for time, space, privacy, so Richard gave it to her. He pulled back on projects, delayed tours. He tried to rebuild their schedule around her recovery. But it was already too late. The disorder had taken hold. And Karen, for all her strength and talent, didn't believe she was worth saving. Richard would later say that anorexia didn't just rob Karen of her body. It robbed her of her voice, her real voice, the one that spoke her needs, her fears, her dreams, because the Karen the world saw, she was a performance. And the real Karen, the one Richard knew and loved, was slowly disappearing in front of his eyes. By the early 1980s, Karen was barely a shadow of the girl who once lit up a room with her laugh. She had grown quieter, more withdrawn. Her frame was impossibly thin, and her energy, what little was left, seemed rationed carefully between rehearsals and rest. But still, she smiled for cameras, still assured everyone she was getting better. And Richard, ever hopeful, tried to believe her. There were moments of light, moments where it seemed like she was coming back. In 1981, she began recording a solo album in New York. It was a chance to reinvent herself, to step out of the image that had confined her for years. But the label shelved it, said it didn't sound Carpenters enough. That decision shattered her. She returned to California devastated. Richard could see the fire in her eyes dimming. She'd taken a risk, spoken in her own voice, and been told it wasn't enough. That was the cruelest part of it all. Karen wasn't just fighting a disorder. She was fighting an industry that constantly pushed her to be smaller, sweeter, quieter. Even in her final act of self-expression, they told her she was too much. Richard later admitted that something in her broke after that. They kept working, kept recording, but it wasn't the same. Karen was polite, cooperative, but distant, detached. She was still singing, but it was as if she'd already left. In late 1982, she checked herself into treatment. She wanted to try to get well, and Richard, hopeful as ever, thought maybe this was the turning point. For a while, things improved. She gained a little weight, began smiling more, making plans. They even started talking about new projects, music, interviews, maybe even touring again. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that it was too fragile, too soon. He watched her closely, studied her moods, her posture, her silences. He wanted to believe she was healing. But deep down, a part of him was already preparing to lose her. On February 4th, 1983, that fear became real. Karen collapsed in her parents' home in Downey. By the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. She was just 32 years old. Richard received the call while preparing for a session. He didn't cry, not at first. He went still, frozen in a kind of silence he would later describe as deafening. And when the tears did come, they didn't stop for hours. He had lost his sister, his musical partner, the one person who had been with him through every note, every beat, every breath of his career. The grief was unbearable, but the guilt was worse. He replayed every moment. Every time he didn't speak up, every time he looked away, every time he told himself she was fine. The months that followed were a blur. Tributes poured in. The world mourned the loss of Karen Carpenter. But Richard, he disappeared. Not from the world, but from himself. He couldn't listen to their songs, couldn't walk into a studio, couldn't even sit at a piano without seeing her face. Because the music that once bound them had become a reminder of everything he couldn't save. In the years after Karen's death, the world moved on. Radio stations kept playing the hits. Magazines published tributes. TV specials aired glowing retrospectives of America's sweethearts, the golden siblings who captured a generation. But for Richard Carpenter, time didn't move at all. The silence in the studio was unbearable. Every instrument felt hollow, every chord incomplete. The melodies they built together now carried a weight he could barely hold. At first, he retreated, not into retirement, but into himself. He didn't want to talk about Karen. Not in interviews, not in public, not even with close friends. Because every time someone asked about her voice, her talent, her legacy, Richard heard what they weren't asking. They weren't asking about the pain, the pressure, the silence between them, the way she'd smile on camera and cry when no one was looking. They didn't ask about the guilt. And that's what followed him. Not the fame, not the fortune, but the memory of a sister who needed help, and a brother who didn't know how to give it in time. Eventually, Richard began speaking again. Not for himself, but for her. He gave interviews, released archival projects, oversaw box sets, documentaries, and remastered albums. Not to sell records, but to protect her, to make sure her story was told with dignity. Because for Richard, Karen wasn't just a voice. She was a whole person, a woman with dreams and fears and private pain the public never saw. And if he couldn't save her then, he could at least make sure no one ever reduced her to a tragedy. He kept everything, her notes, her letters, her journals. And over time, he opened parts of that archive to the world. Not to expose her, but to remind people of who she really was. Funny, sharp, opinionated. So much more than the soft-spoken girl they saw on TV. Behind closed doors, Richard also became an advocate. Quietly, carefully, he supported causes related to eating disorder awareness. He didn't want attention. He didn't want credit. He just wanted fewer families to go through what his had. He once said in an interview, "If I had understood then what I know now, maybe we'd be having a very different conversation." That quote haunted fans, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't self-serving. It was just honest. Honest in a way Richard rarely allowed himself to be. Because no matter how many tributes he curated, no matter how many awards he accepted in Karen's name, the truth stayed the same. He would never forgive himself. Not fully. He didn't need sympathy. He didn't want the spotlight. All he wanted was to hold on to the memory of his sister, to protect the small parts of her the world never got to see. The home videos, the inside jokes, the way she lit up when they harmonized just right. That was his Karen. And for the rest of his life, Richard has carried her voice like a ghost. Always just behind him. Not haunting, not accusing, just there. A quiet reminder of everything they built, everything they lost, and everything that still lingers in the silence. Today, Richard Carpenter lives a quieter life. He still plays music, still visits the studio, but it's different now, slower, more intentional. He's not chasing hits, not trying to reclaim anything. He's just remembering. At 78, Richard has outlived the decades of grief that once threatened to bury him. He's watched new generations discover the Carpenters, heard covers of Karen's songs on talent shows, seen tributes on social media. He even released a solo piano album, instrumental renditions of the music he once made with her. But the heart of it all still belongs to Karen. He rarely speaks in absolutes. He avoids sensationalism. Even when asked about the most painful moments, he chooses his words carefully. Because for Richard, speaking about Karen is like opening a fragile keepsake box. Every word risks breaking something. But recently, in one of his few interviews, he said something that caught everyone off guard. The interviewer had asked him if he thought people finally understood what Karen had been going through. If the world had finally caught up to what was missed. Richard paused, looked down, and said quietly, "Not really. I think people still see the voice, not the cost." That line said everything. Because for Richard, the tragedy wasn't just that Karen died young. It was that she died unheard. Everyone knew the songs, but no one really listened to what they were saying. Listen again to Rainy Days and Mondays, to Goodbye to Love, to the way her voice bends, not just from note to note, but from feeling to feeling. She was trying to tell us, all along. And now, decades later, Richard is still trying to tell us that there was a person behind the voice, a sister behind the icon, a story that was never fully told. In his home, there are still photos of them on stage, in the studio, laughing backstage. He doesn't show them to visitors, doesn't keep them in grand display. They're tucked in corners, framed quietly, meant for him, because some memories are too sacred to share, and some grief never demands attention, it just stays. Karen's story isn't just about illness. It's about a culture that demanded perfection from someone too gentle to survive it. And Richard, he was part of that world, not by choice but by proximity. He was the brother, the producer, the collaborator. He was close enough to see it unravel and too close to stop it. He said before that there's no one moment, no single decision he regrets the most. But what haunts him is everything that was never said. The days he didn't ask how she was feeling, the dinners he didn't push her to eat, the silences he didn't break. Because sometimes the things you don't say become the loudest echoes. And that's the weight Richard Carpenter has carried for 40 years. Not because he failed her, but because he loved her, truly, deeply, and imperfectly. And now, as time marches on, the legacy of Karen Carpenter lives on through every note, every lyric, every quiet space between the music. Not just as a voice, but as a warning, as a memory, as a sister who meant everything to the one person who knew her best. For more of the latest news, check out this video.